All right, today I want to start out by saying, just like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. Mostly because panicking never helps anybody. Anytime that you're in any kind of a situation where you feel like there might be some kind of a crisis, one of the worst things you can do is panic. So I think we should start with what we know. What we know is that President Trump signed an executive order on Thursday, March 20th of 2025 to order the shutdown of the Department of Education. So, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if we're completely honest with ourselves, we don't know because we don't know what this shutdown of the Department of Education is going to look like. There are a lot of questions that remain unanswered as of yet, and I think we first need to really think about the current state of our education system. So, with that said, when it comes to the state of our education system, one of the first things people think about is where we stand in comparison to other countries on standardized testing. The Program for International Student Assessment, the PISA, is considered to be one of the best measures concerning the academic achievement of more than 80 different countries. In the United States, a demographically representative sample of 15-year-old students from both public and private schools participate in the PISA. And it measures the ability of those in 7th grade or higher in reading, mathematics, and scientific knowledge. While in principle, every 15-year-old student can be selected for the PISA test on the basis of a randomized sample, countries are allowed to exclude up to 5% of the student population to sit the exams. And the criteria for that exclusion is as follows. Geographical inaccessibility to the school. So if it's a virtual student or maybe a homeschool student. So if they aren't geographically able to access the school, that's going to eliminate them as a possibility. Special schools, that will allow you to limit 2% of the population, and the geographical inaccessibility allows you to eliminate 0.5%. Finally, you can exclude students within schools on the basis of a disability or lack of language proficiency. So that's 2.5% of the students can be eliminated for that purpose. And this is an important exception, because very little in the way of accommodations is offered on the PISA. So the 2022 results indicated that the United States had an overall rank of 18 and was below average in mathematics. However, I think it's worth pointing out that not all countries choose to educate students with disabilities. And while you can choose to exclude 2.5% of students due to disability or lack of language proficiency, what if one country has a greater percentage of students with disabilities than another? One of the things that sets us apart from many countries in the world is our federal legislation ensuring a free and appropriate education for all children regardless of disabilities. Prior to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, only 1 out of every 5 children with a disability received an education in our public schools. Today, schools are required by law to provide a free and appropriate education to all students regardless of disability. That's pretty impressive. And it places the United States in a small category of about 13 countries with strong laws that define and protect the educational rights of students with disabilities in different ways, but regardless, they do have strong laws that protect their students with disabilities. These countries include Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and the United States. None of the top 7 countries on the 2022 PISA test scores were within that group. Obviously, it's wonderful that the United States and others have worked so hard to make education accessible to everyone. And this is especially important in the United States. As Thomas Jefferson once said, an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. In other words, to live up to the responsibility of self-governance, we must be well educated or suffer the wrath of tyranny. But to try and say we have made it to the mountaintop when it comes to truly inclusive education would be foolish. I know from working in schools that there are many times students are not getting the supports they are supposed to be ensured through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. If students are lucky, then their cases end up being taken through due process to ensure they receive the education they have been promised. However, there are many cases where situations are never reported or are brushed under the rug by the district. Most of the situations I witnessed while working in public schools fell into this latter category. Situations where students were raped at school, fed rotten food, physically assaulted, and received extreme educational neglect. Clearly, to say that we have arrived and nothing should be changed is wrong. And every administration since IDEA has promised to improve the situation with our education system. So this isn't a new concern. And it is true that there is a lot of waste within the education system. Some of the research studies that have been funded are scientifically laughable. In the 1970s, for instance, we built schools without walls because we had this theory called the open classroom theory, where if we put children in schools with no walls, they would learn more. When it didn't totally pan out, we still had all of these school buildings that we had built, and many have partitions today in an attempt to cut down on the sensory overload of these buildings. Meanwhile, we have tons of funding for theories like an open classroom theory where we build complete schools without walls. But teachers are given significant limitations as far as how much copy paper they can purchase for the year from their funding, or how many copies they can get for the year. And a lot of times, teachers will end up making up the difference using their own funds. And teachers aren't that well paid to begin with. So, we definitely have issues. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, because this becomes a particularly big talking point for every election season that we have. How are we going to improve education? And I don't think that yes, we do have issues with our education. I'm not going to argue against that. But I also don't know that we are definitely ranked lower than some of the other countries in the world. But I think one of the things that's not truly being accounted for is the amount of work we have done to include as many students with disabilities as possible. And I think that does make a difference given what we saw as the top 7 performing countries on the PISA did not fall into that category of countries that have strong legal code protecting the education of students with disabilities. So the real question remains, how is the Trump administration, and specifically the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, going to make this shutdown happen? And I know many are concerned that Linda McMahon is coming primarily from the perspective of an outsider in the business of education. In a recent interview, she acknowledged that she did not know what the letters of IDEA stood for. So while it does show she's not coming into this position with a great deal of experience with education, is it necessary to be an educational insider? Some could argue that being an educational outsider could give you a more objective view of what could be done to improve our educational system. And this wouldn't be the first time that the government has called in an outsider for a fresh perspective. But still, the question remains. Who will be responsible for ensuring that students with disabilities receive a free and appropriate education, or at least as free and appropriate of an education as what passes for students currently? Is there a better way to ensure that students with disabilities are getting the education we have promised them? We don't know. Change is not always bad, so I'm going to reserve judgment until I see how this might end up looking. I do suspect that some families may choose to opt out of public education during this transition, as large transitions are rarely smooth. And to a point, I could see some of that being a good thing. We have come to believe that in order to be good at something, you must be an expert in that field of study and have certifications backing that knowledge up. Therefore, parents can't possibly educate their own children effectively. But I know from the many children I've worked with, including my own, that education is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. We have used our education system to put roadblock after roadblock in front of our teachers, burying them under bureaucratic red tape. Opting out of a bureaucratic system could result in better outcomes for students with disabilities. And thanks to the growth of state scholarship programs and the flexibility of homeschooling, parents have more options available to them than ever before. Unfortunately, the people this will ultimately harm are the families caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place of limited time and limited funds. But this is nothing new, because even within our public schools, the families with limited time and limited funds are also the families least likely to access advocacy supports. And there are likely to be many, as of yet unknown, consequences for dismantling the Department of Education. The good news is that regardless of how things turn out, we, the American people, have the option to advocate for more change. And working to improve education for all is never a bad thing. In fact, it is obvious that the American people truly value education for all in our efforts to constantly improve our education system, whether those improvements work out or not. So it's definitely something that we as a people value. And I think that's really worthwhile. I don't think it shows up as well in the test scores for the PISA, and I think it is something that is well worth doing, but it is not something that shows up well on test scores. It is not something that's measured by successful performance on tests. So, big conclusions? We don't know yet, because we don't know what's going to be happening. I'm definitely going to continue watching it, and I'm hoping for the best. That tends to always be what I do. I tend to look at things and always hope for the best. Will it be the best? I don't know. I have no earthly idea. It could end up being a good thing. It might not be a good thing. There's really no way to know, because it hasn't been done. And we've had the Department of Education around for quite some time. So this is a pretty big change. Hopefully it won't cause too many consequences for students with disabilities in the short term, as we are working through whatever transitional period we may be looking at for whatever happens or gets passed off as far as IDEA goes, and who is responsible for taking charge of those things. So we'll see, but I don't think we have ever arrived in education at a point where we have truly arrived and are doing a wonderful job of education and have nothing to improve upon. We always have things to improve upon. So this is just another attempt at trying to improve upon our education system. Maybe it'll go well. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll go down kind of like the open classroom theory. It's hard to say. But as a government by the people, we always have the opportunity to fight for more change. That is worked into our legal code. So I choose to try to be as optimistic as possible and watch what happens and see, and be ready to do whatever's needed to advocate for children no matter what.